Trump just named the next target. It's a mountain. This week, the President of the United States stood in the Oval Office and named a target most people had never heard of before. A mountain in central Iran. Within hours, American bombers were confirmed in the air. Online, claims are spreading that Marines have already landed on an Iranian island and run into serious trouble. Some of that is fully verified. Some of it traces back to a single commentator's account. By the end of this documentary, you'll know exactly which is which and why the next 72 hours could include a strike that's been threatened, on and off, for over a year. If you want this war explained with verified sourcing instead of amplified claims, subscribe. This story is moving fast. Somewhere over the Zagros Mountains this week, B-1 bombers left British airspace, and for the first time in this war, a single mountain became the story everyone in Washington and Tehran was watching. Let's establish the timeline first, because this war has now run long enough that even careful observers lose track of where things actually stand. Israel and the United States launched a joint strike campaign against Iran on February 28, 2026. A ceasefire took effect in early April, followed by a memorandum of understanding in June intended to resolve the harder nuclear questions over 60 days. That ceasefire, by nearly every independent account, was fragile from the start, marred by intermittent strikes on both sides, even while it technically held. It effectively collapsed in the second week of July, when President Trump declared the truce over following Iranian strikes on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and American forces resumed large-scale strikes, roughly 90 targets in a single night, according to U.S. Central Command's own statements. As of this recording, that resumed campaign has run for more than 10 consecutive nights, with Iran's health ministry reporting more than 50 people killed and over 500 wounded since strikes resumed. So when your source described a dramatic new strike on Tehran as a fresh escalatory first, the more precise picture is this. Tehran itself had not been directly targeted for a stretch of months, even as dozens of other Iranian cities and coastal targets absorbed nightly strikes throughout the resumed campaign. A renewed strike specifically on the capital, with air defense systems activating and detonations heard in the northeast of a metropolitan area of roughly 15 million people, would represent a genuine and significant escalatory step within that broader campaign. A shift from degrading coastal military and shipping-related infrastructure toward retargeting the seat of government itself. This is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, even though this documentary cannot independently confirm every claim detail of a single night's reporting from social media and wire services alone. Now to the story genuinely dominating this week's headlines, and this one is unambiguously real. Pickaxe Mountain. This is not a dramatic nickname invented for a video title. It is the actual working name used by Western media and non-proliferation researchers for a site Iran calls Kuh Kolangazla, a peak in the Zagros Range, roughly a mile and a half south of the Natanz enrichment complex. Iran has been excavating a deep underground facility into this mountain since 2020, with tunnel entrances that satellite imagery analysts believe lead to holes more than 100 meters beneath solid rock. President Trump has now explicitly and repeatedly threatened to strike it, telling reporters in the Oval Office this week that the U.S. would be hitting that area, probably pretty soon, and multiple B-1 Lancer bombers have been confirmed departing UK airspace alongside aerial refueling tankers, with Britain's new Prime Minister reportedly approving the use of UK bases for the operation. This is about as close to fully verified, multi-source confirmed reporting as this fast-moving war produces. It comes from CNN, CNBC, and the Boston Globe independently within the same news cycle. Why does this specific site matter so much more than the dozens of other targets struck in this war? Here is where your transcripts numbers hold up better than you might expect. The International Atomic Energy Agency's own Director General has stated that Iran possessed roughly 441 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% as of last year. Material that, with further enrichment, would be sufficient for multiple nuclear weapons. Crucially, the IAEA's own assessment is that a significant portion of that stockpile is not confirmed destroyed, but rather believed to be stored in deep tunnels at this same Natanz adjacent complex. This is the important nuance your transcript's framing simplified into a lie. American officials did not necessarily fabricate claims about destroying the Natanz facility itself in the earlier 2025 strikes, codenamed Operation Midnight Hammer, but the enriched uranium stockpile inside it is a separate question from the facility's structure, and independent non-proliferation monitors, not just skeptical commentators, have been the ones raising doubts about whether that material was actually destroyed, moved, or remains recoverable. Treating this as proof of a deliberate American lie overstates what is, more precisely, a genuine and still unresolved verification gap that the IAEA itself has flagged. Let's turn to the most explosive claim in your source material, that U.S. Marines have already landed on Qeshm Island and run into serious trouble, including near impossible-to-clear tunnel networks. Here, precision matters enormously because this claim sits at 3 different levels of confirmation, not one. Level 1, fully verified. Qeshm Island has been struck repeatedly by U.S. airstrikes throughout the resumed July campaign, with Iranian state media reporting explosions near Masan village and elsewhere on the island on multiple separate nights, and U.S. fighter jets confirmed flying over the island. Level 2. Credibly reported, but not confirmed as executed. The Pentagon has reportedly moved thousands of additional troops toward the region, including elements of the 82nd Airborne Division and multiple Marine Expeditionary Units, and military analysts have spent months publicly discussing Qeshm specifically as a plausible target for a raid aimed at either its underground missile and drone storage, or at securing enriched uranium stockpiles believed to be reachable from the area. Level 3. Unconfirmed speculation from a single named source. The specific claim that Marines already landed overnight and became bogged down fighting through tunnels comes from former CIA analyst Larry Johnson, a commentator who has been publicly and repeatedly warning for months that any ground operation on Qeshm or nearby Karg Island would be a suicide mission, using language nearly identical to what's being reported now. No official confirmation exists from U.S. Central Command, and independent defense outlets covering this story have explicitly noted that no verified report exists of Iranian ground forces engaging in a confirmed operation of this kind. The responsible conclusion: a ground raid on Qeshm has been a real, seriously discussed military option for months, actively debated by defense analysts as extraordinarily risky given Iran's tunnel networks and drone-saturated coastline, but a specific claim that it has already happened and gone wrong, sourced to one commentator's account, should be treated as unconfirmed until multiple independent sources corroborate it. What does this reveal at the intelligence analyst level? It reveals that the ground operation option has moved from theoretical think tank discussion to something senior defense officials are visibly preparing for, evidenced by real troop repositioning, and that the risk profile every serious military analyst has attached to this option is genuinely severe. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has structured its defense around what regional security analysts call a mosaic defense, a deliberately decentralized command structure with roughly 31 separate provincial commands, each holding autonomy to launch missiles and drones independently. This structure, adopted specifically in response to watching Iraq's centralized military collapse in 2003, means that even a successful initial landing on an island like Qeshm would not neutralize the surrounding threat the way seizing a capital or a central command node might have in a previous era of warfare. Analysts across the political spectrum, from the Davish Quincy Institute to more hawkish outlets, converge on the same underlying assessment here. Landing troops on these islands is the comparatively easy part. Holding them, resupplying them, and extracting them afterward under sustained drone and missile fire from an enemy with no single command node to eliminate is the far harder and more dangerous problem. Now let's address the missile shortage claim directly, because this is where your transcript's framing turns out to be more accurate than sensationalized. The Telegraph did in fact report, in the days immediately preceding this recording, that Pentagon insiders fear the true state of U.S. munitions stockpiles may not be fully reaching the White House, citing a culture of reluctance to deliver unwelcome assessments to Defense Secretary Hegseth. This is independently corroborated by separate reporting from the Washington Post, citing a Pentagon official who said American forces lack sufficient THAAD interceptors to safely sustain the current air campaign. and by CSIS analysis, estimating the U.S. expended roughly half its Patriot interceptor stockpile in this conflict's opening phase alone, with full replenishment of Tomahawk and THAAD stocks not expected until 2029 or later, given production lines running at a small fraction of the consumption rate. The Pentagon's own spokesperson has publicly denied these shortage reports in strong terms, calling the coverage an attempt to portray the world's strongest military as weak. Both things are on the record: credible, sourced reporting describing a serious depletion problem, and an official government denial. This documentary treats that as exactly what it is: a live, unresolved dispute between anonymous officials and public spokespeople, not a settled fact in either direction. Though the sheer number of independent outlets reporting similar depletion figures from CSIS's own published analysis gives the shortage claims more evidentiary weight than the denial currently carries. This connects directly to the intelligence assessment your transcript cited from the Washington Post, and this one checks out as reported. Current and former U.S. officials, speaking anonymously about sensitive assessments, have indeed concluded that continued strikes are unlikely to meaningfully soften Iran's negotiating position, describing the current Washington-Tehran relationship as suspended in an uncertain state between war and peace. What does this reveal at the strategic level? It reveals a genuine and unusual gap between the operational tempo of this war, nightly strikes, expanding target sets, threats against previously untouched sites like Pickaxe Mountain, and the American intelligence community's own assessment of what that tempo is actually achieving. Wars do not typically continue to escalate this visibly, while the people assessing their strategic value privately conclude that escalation isn't working. That gap itself, rather than any single strike, may be the most analytically significant detail in this entire update. Let's apply systems thinking across the board. At the immediate military level, both sides are now drawing down finite, expensive, and slow-to-replace precision munitions stockpiles at a rate that constrains future options regardless of political willpower, a resource ceiling that no amount of escalatory rhetoric can remove. At the political level, Iran's post-Khamenei leadership, managing its own internal legitimacy crisis, faces continued pressure to demonstrate resolve, even as its military capacity to meaningfully retaliate against a direct strike on Pickaxe Mountain remains genuinely uncertain. At the economic level, global oil markets continue reacting sharply to every escalatory signal, with Brent crude posting some of its largest single-day moves in years around each new phase of this conflict. At the regional level, host nations across the Gulf remain caught in the crossfire of a war they did not start, absorbing retaliatory strikes intended for American forces on their soil. And at the long-term global level, the same munition systems being depleted against Iran, Patriot, THAAD, Tomahawk, JASSM, are the identical systems the United States would need in a future confrontation involving China or North Korea, meaning this war's ammunition costs are quietly being paid in part by American strategic readiness in an entirely different theater. Let's red team this. An alternative reading of the Pickaxe Mountain threats worth taking seriously. Some analysts argue this could be primarily coercive signaling rather than a near-certain strike, a way to pressure Iran back toward the negotiating table by publicly threatening its most secure remaining nuclear asset, without Washington having fully committed to executing a strike that carries real technical uncertainty, given that the facility's exact schematics remain unknown, and its depth may exceed what even America's most powerful bunker-buster munitions can reliably penetrate. Under this reading, the highly public nature of the bomber deployment, visible departures, on-record ministerial approvals, is itself a form of pressure distinct from an actual decision to strike, and previous public threats against this same site have not always translated into immediate action. This does not mean the threat is empty. It means multiple explanations remain live, and a single week's dramatic headlines should not be read as certain proof of an imminent attack. It's also worth naming the historical parallel carefully. Commentators drawing a line to the build-up toward the 2003 Iraq invasion, when ground troops assembled safely over many months before a land war began, are right to note the echo of boots-on-the-ground discussion. But the differences are exactly why every serious analyst covering this specific question insists the parallel breaks down quickly. In 2003, coalition forces could mass in neighboring bases without facing sustained drone and missile fire during the buildup itself. Today, any U.S. ground force gathering in the region operates under constant threat from exactly the kind of dispersed, drone and missile-capable adversary Iran has built specifically because it watched how quickly a centralized force like Saddam Hussein's collapsed. That is precisely why multiple defense analysts across the ideological spectrum describe any current ground operation as bearing more resemblance to a high-risk raid than to a 2003-style invasion buildup. So where does this leave things in the days immediately ahead? In the best-case scenario, the threatened strike on Pickaxe Mountain functions as intended coercive pressure and quiet diplomatic channels, the same ones that have kept producing partial ceasefires throughout this war. Produce a renewed, more durable pause before any strike on the mountain itself becomes necessary. In the most likely scenario, based on the pattern of the last 10 nights, strikes continue expanding in scope, munition stockpiles continue depleting on both sides, and the war grinds forward in exactly the unresolved middle state between peace and war that U.S. intelligence officials have themselves described, without a single decisive event resolving it. In the worst-case scenario, a strike on Pickaxe Mountain fails to destroy or secure the enriched uranium stockpile believed to be stored there, triggering exactly the proliferation risk that non-proliferation experts have warned about, a material dispersed or lost track of during active combat, rather than safely destroyed. And in the wildcard scenario, a confirmed, verified ground engagement, distinct from the current unconfirmed reports, does occur on Keshim or a similar island, producing American casualties serious enough to fundamentally change the domestic political calculus in Washington, regardless of what happens on any other front. None of these outcomes is guaranteed, and this documentary will not claim otherwise. What is verified without qualification is this. American bombers are in the air. A nuclear-linked mountain in central Iran is now the specific named target of a sitting American president. Pentagon officials are engaged in an open dispute over whether the White House even has an accurate picture of remaining munition stockpiles, and America's own intelligence community has concluded, in reporting neither side has denied, that continued strikes are unlikely to change Tehran's calculus. Layered on top of that verified foundation are specific, dramatic claims. A completed ground raid gone wrong, a deliberate lie about destroyed uranium that deserve real skepticism until they clear a higher bar of independent confirmation than a single commentator's account currently provides. So here's the question worth sitting with. Given that B-1 bombers are already in the air, that Pickaxe Mountain has now been named explicitly by the president as a target, and that America's own officials privately doubt continued strikes will change anything, what do you think is more likely to define the next 24 to 72 hours? A confirmed strike on Pickaxe Mountain itself, or a diplomatic off-ramp that, once again, pulls this war back from the edge it keeps approaching? There's one more claim worth handling carefully. The retired U.S. general who reportedly compared a prolonged Iran conflict to the 20-year American commitment that followed the 2003 Iraq invasion, invoking the long-running Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch no-fly zone enforcement as a historical parallel for how long a sustained American military presence in the region might last. Statements like this from retired flag officers are common in this kind of prolonged conflict, and they carry real weight precisely because retired generals speak with more candor than serving officers still inside the chain of command. But a single retired general's forecast, however experienced that general may be, is one voice among many competing assessments, not a Pentagon planning document. It should be weighed alongside, not instead of, the intelligence community's own more cautious assessment that the war currently sits in an unresolved middle state. Because a 20-year commitment and an unresolved stalemate are two different predictions from two different sources, and this documentary isn't going to pretend they agree with each other just because both sound suitably grave. It's worth stepping back to consider what a war lasting this long, at this intensity, actually costs beyond the missile counts and troop deployments. Iran's own economy has been described by its president as now facing pressure as serious as the military campaign itself, with inflation running near 90% year-on-year as of the most recent figures. American defense planners are watching munitions, stockpiles needed for an entirely different potential conflict, with China over Taiwan or with North Korea, drain away in a war whose strategic payoff even America's own intelligence assessments increasingly doubt. And ordinary people across a dozen affected countries, from Iranian families in Tabriz and Isfahan to Kuwaiti, Bahraini, and Jordanian civilians living under intermittent air raid sirens, continue absorbing the daily, cumulative cost of a conflict that shows no sign of a clean resolution in either direction. That is the sober reality underneath this week's most dramatic headline about a mountain and a stockpile of enriched uranium. A war that has now run for nearly 5 months, that neither side's own experts believe is achieving its stated goals, and that keeps finding new, more dangerous places to escalate, precisely because the diplomatic off-ramps that briefly worked in April and June have not held.